Well, hello everyone. My name is Cheryl Woodruff. I'm the Deputy Director at the Washington Square Park Conservancy. We just reached the 12:30 hour, so or half hour as it were. Usually we find people sign on right at the time when the program starts, so we're just going to give it one more minute. But in the meantime, we're just going to come on live so you know we're here. Hey, Grace.
Hey, Cheryl.
So I did see just a few more people log in, so I am going to just give it to the 12:30 before we get going.
Sounds like a plan.
Give all the housekeeping and a short intro, and we keep it to half an hour.
Yes. We've been very good about that.
Well, I think people have other things on their agendas. Okay, 12:31. So welcome everyone. You are here at our last lunchtime lecture of the season. We thought we'd do something a little more fun for Halloween week. We're gonna have the pleasure of hearing from Grace Harmon, our senior community relations manager here at the Washington Square Park Conservancy, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the scary stories that we've heard, put them in perspective, myth, truth, all that fun information. I have heard a lot of stories about the park, so I'm interested if anyone has a new story out there. So when we get to the Q&A, I'd love to hear from you about any scary stories you've heard. Just some quick housekeeping. We are recording today, and we will present a recording to everyone who attended. You can use either the chat function here if you have some questions. If you're having any technical difficulties, I'll be on in the background and can help. There's also the Q&A chat box that you can use. If you have a question please put them in, and we'll, at the end of the half hour, we'll save a little bit of time for your questions there. So Grace, as our communications guru, gets to hear from a lot of folks about some of these stories. So I'm excited to hear what you have on deck for us, Grace. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yes, we don't talk a lot about the creepier parts of the park because there are so many beautiful parts to talk about that are frankly just a lot more enjoyable. But this time of year, it's raining, Halloween's coming up. It seemed like a good time to talk about some scary stories about the park. And, like all good scary stories, there is some truth to some of them, but a lot of it is big imagination, I think, is a nice way of putting it.
Excellent. So, I'll let you take it over, and I'll mute and go dark so I'm not in the way.
Thanks, Cheryl. So one of the most chilling stories of Washington Square Park is actually the one with the most truth to it. From 1797 to 1825, the area was used as a potter's field. And the rectangle, so here on the screen, you've got a map, and the rectangle that you're looking at is the borders of the park today, that dashed rectangle. And then the creek is this dark line here, that's Minetta. And this area with the polka dots in it is where the potter's field was. And over here, this is private farmland, and this hashed area you're seeing is some church land. And so following the Revolutionary War, the city needed a public burial ground for the poor and the indigent. And it's estimated that there are about 20,000 bodies buried under the ground. Many of them were victims of yellow fever. There were spikes in 1797, the same year that the Potter's Field opened, 1798, 1801, and 1803. And it seems a little odd. Why would you put a potter's field in the middle of such a busy neighborhood? That's then, this was actually the suburbs. This was pretty rural and far from the city center at the tip of Manhattan. There were also a number of churches in the area. Again, that's part of what the land you're seeing here, that had their own cemeteries. So it kind of made sense. Potter's Field is a necessity, a grim one, but one nonetheless. And putting it far away where there were already other bodies seemed logical. There are not many known depictions from historic records of what the Potter's Field looked like, but we do know a few things from those records while there aren't images. There was a cottage where a keeper of the Potter's Field lived, which had its own well. By 1799, it was enclosed by a fence around the borders. And there is a record of a request in 1811 from the third keeper, a man named William Room, to cut down some poplar trees that ringed the burial ground, so it wasn't barren land or anything like that. And there are minutes from the Common Council meeting that have references to altering Minetta Creek, which again is the western boundary here of the Potter's Field. And so we can presume that the area was kind of watery, uneven terrain, but eventually it became leveled out over prolonged use. So another spooky story that is true is that there was a grave robbery in the Potter's Field. While most people would probably avoid going in there, in late April of 1824, one young gentleman literally dove right in. In the early morning hours, around 3 a.m. of a late April day, the keeper at the time, a man named Mr. Sherman, Sherman, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, believed that he was hearing noises coming from the field, and he suspected individuals of attempting to remove the dead. So he called out 2 watchmen, which were the equivalent of police at the time, took his trusty dog, and they struck out into the field. Eventually, they came upon an open grave and demanded that the individual within it remove himself from the pit. When they received no response, Mr. Sherman sent in his dog, who chased out a tall, stout fellow, according to a newspaper record. That's how they referred to him, a tall, stout fellow who took off running with the dog hot on his heels. And the dog did eventually catch up to the man named Solomon Parmley, who had a chisel on him to pry open the coffins. He was indicted for a misdemeanor and recovering the covers of 10 coffins. In defense, he tried to claim that he was drunk and just trying to sleep it off in the grave, but the jury did not buy that, and he was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison. There was a story that ran about him in the New York Evening Post, which was accompanied by an admonition to all medical students in New York to take heed of Parmley's fate, which sort of indicates that he was grave robbing for the purpose of securing bodies for medical or scientific research, which doesn't make it any less creepy to be digging around in a grave. So from the Potter's Field and its true stories, we're gonna move to one that's maybe rooted in some truth, but has taken creative license, which is that Washington Square Park was once used as an execution ground. So while it's true that it was once a Potter's Field, it is not true that the land was used as an execution ground. The stories say that soon after the Potter's Field opened and the public burials began, that the city sheriff erected a public gallows near where the fountain is now and began performing executions and burying bodies in the field. Now, it's not so far-fetched as far as myths go. The Potter's Field was established. It was a place to bury people. There was a prison, Sing Sing, on the Hudson River less than a mile away, which had plenty of prisoners who needed executing, presumably, and burial. But there are no historic records documenting a gallows in the Potter's Field or any regular executions there. And for a city that keeps such good documentation, I mean, look at all of the things that we know about the Potter's Field itself from city records. It makes me a bit incredulous that there would have been, you know, an entire gallows erected and multiple people executed and buried, but there are no records. And that is especially my thinking when we get to our next story, which is about a young woman named Rose Butler, who is actually the only recorded execution in the Potter's Field. So Rose was a young domestic slave in the area, in the city. She was only 19 years old when she was convicted of arson. She was accused of attempting to burn down her master's home while he slept inside with his family. And although no one was harmed, it did, and there was no physical damage. It was like 2 or 3 steps suffered some burns, but Rose was still sentenced to hang. And this terrible incident took place in 1819, which is during New York's very complex period of gradual emancipation. Blacks may have been free or indentured or remained in slavery based on their age and their circumstance. And slavery in New York did not come to a definitive end until 1827, which incidentally is the same year that Washington Square opened as a park. So moving on to our next story, it is about the lovely English elm tree in the northwest corner of Washington Square Park. And it's, if estimates are correct about its age, it is about 350 years old, which would make it one of the oldest trees or even the oldest tree in Manhattan. And if my math is correct, and I do believe it is, that means that it has been there since the late 1600s. So it is a very long time for a tree. And many of you may have heard this tree referred to as the Hangman's Elm. And that is probably my biggest pet peeve. One of my biggest pet peeves, maybe apart from skateboarders in Washington Square Park, is hearing people refer to this beautiful, stately old tree as a hanging tree or the Hangman's Elm or anything like that. It does not deserve that very grim name. The stories about the tree all make the same general claim that it was used for executions. In one variation of the story, traitors were hung from the tree during the Revolutionary War as sort of a warning message, and people could see them as they walked by. In another version of the story, the Marquis de Lafayette himself watched the execution of 20 highwaymen who were strung up in the branches for their crimes. But these are all stories that are not recorded anywhere until the late 19th century, which is the first time that any reference crops up in a historical record about the hangings taking place. And so they're retellings of who knows how many retellings. You know, in fact, one piece of historical evidence kind of helps to disprove that story, which is that at the time the executions supposedly took place, the tree was actually standing on private land. Again, this is that map we were looking at. The tree stands sort of over here, and this would have been part of the Ludlow farm. So during the time that the tree was used for executions, standing on public land, maybe, but on private, it is even less likely. And so it's, you know, it's likely one of those stories, again, similar to the execution ground, that's cropped up due to the parks, or rather the story's proximity to a public burial ground. You know, that's rather creepy, a little gross maybe. And so it's over the years, over the generations, maybe given rise to some more embellished stories there. And our last spooky story has nothing to do with the Potter's Field or the burial ground or executions or anything like that. This one is pretty much pure wild speculation if I had to take a guess. But Washington Square Park is haunted, not by the souls of the people buried beneath our feet, not by Rose Butler, but by a little black dog named Fala, seen in this photo here. Now, Fala was the Roosevelt's dog, specifically President Roosevelt's dog. And from 1942 to 1949, Eleanor Roosevelt lived at 29 Washington Square, right on the corner of the park, actually across from the English elm tree that we were just speaking about. It was one of a number of her homes, but she did live there for that period of time. And Fala would visit her there and go on walks in the park up until his master's death in 1945, at which point Fala, who was a Scottish Terrier, went to live with Eleanor Roosevelt, and they presumably would have continued walking through the park. But it is said that on a very quiet evening, if you are still and silent and you watch carefully, you can see a little dog wandering around through the park, sad and lonely, looking for his beloved master. Which I have been in the park at night late when it is quiet. I have never seen a sad little dog, but maybe one of you has. And so that takes us to the end of our spooky stories. If you have any questions or if you have any stories you'd like to share, this was a little bit shorter than we normally go, so we do have plenty of time at the end, so feel free to chime in. Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, Grace. So the first question I'd like you to address is the some of the movies that have been filmed in the park that are scary movies. So there is I Am Legend. There's Ghostbusters, where they had one of the ghosts go through. So have you heard any kind of stories related to those movies, and that like someone says, oh, like during the filming something happened, or anything along those lines?
I have not, although I have heard people say that the reason that they have that Washington Square Park was one of the places they wanted to do it was because with the number of bodies buried there, it is logical that there would be ghosts. So of course, Ghostbusters would need to make a visit. I have never seen a ghost in the arch. Just gonna throw that out there.
I've never seen a ghost anywhere in Washington Square Park. It just seems so. I rarely feel alone there. You know,
Yeah.
like early in the morning or late. There's almost always someone, but someone else there, and I think like that alone factor kind of you know. But
yeah.
There's nearby, there's a lot of haunting stories over at the Merchant's House Museum, and that's not so far from us. Of course, a family lived there with their domestic servants for a long period of time, and it was one family for such a period. But
the tradition of haunting is often, I don't think you usually hear about a park being haunted. It's a home or a space or a creepy old museum or something. Interior, not so much an exterior space.
Yeah. Okay, so I have not seen any questions come in. So if anyone has a question, you can either use the chat box or the Q&A. I did have one last question of mine, since I'm not seeing any of the attendees come in. And that is, the Halloween parade
Yes. Very good question.
Yeah, so the Halloween parade did have a connection to Washington Square Park at one point, right?
Yes. You mean the big city one, not the NYC?
Right, yeah, the big city one, yeah.
Remembering correctly, it used to come through the park.
Right, yeah. And I think it's it's kind of cool to think about the over the years it had different, trajectories through the village.
Yeah.
But like in its first couple of years, it was just such a homegrown thing, starting with all the artists' families at Westbeth.
Yep.
And like with those great puppets of Ralph Lee and all that. And, so like Westbeth over to the park basically. And then as it got bigger and bigger, the city had to kind of like have regulations on where it went.
Out it around and yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's no parade this year.
There is a puppet virtual Halloween, like where they're using smaller puppets, which is kind of cool. It kind of gets back to its origins.
I like seeing all the virtual things just like this that people have come up with to be creative.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions pop up in the box. So this might be our shortest lunch lecture ever.
Well, that's a way to go out, I guess. And thank you everyone for being with us and for sticking through this series. And we'll hope to see you in the park sometime soon.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.